welcome to Silver Threads, where we are still walking, still waking. I'm Carla Bergman.
And I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is the show where we trace our present path through the people and stories of the past as we ourselves, long-term radicals, learn about each other, from each other, and continue to walk, continue to wake. This week, we're joined by Klee Benally. Klee Benally is a Dene musician, traditional dancer, artist, filmmaker, and Indigenous anarchist. Klee is originally from Black Mesa and has worked nearly all of his life at the front lines in struggles to protect Indigenous sacred lands. Klee provides strategic planning and direct action training with Indigenous Action. Klee has helped establish a range of organizations, including Talahugan Info Shop, Protect the Peaks, and is currently organizing COVID-19 response with a Kinlani Mutual Aid and indigenousmutualaid.org. Thanks so much for joining us, Klee.
Yate, happy to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Let's get to it. First question that we'd like to throw at our guests is to ask you to maybe take us on a little historical journey of your life as a radical or militant or however you identify yourself. And we're particularly interested in looking at maybe watershed moments, and maybe you could share some of those with us.
We have to share the challenges. I think the failures, the sadness, the suffering, if we don't explore, analyze, and embrace that on some levels, I think we're really cheating ourselves and other organizers out of powerful experiences that we should learn from. And so I'm a fan, actually, of sharing the pain, not as a masochist. I think a lot for me was about growing up around other folks who were fearless. And so I come from an area on Black Mesa on the Dene Nation where my elders have been resisting forced relocation since 1974. Congress passed a law called PL 93-531, which was known as the Relocation Act, essentially to divide the Hopi and Dene peoples, to really conquer and divide, to open up the area to access mineral resources. Specifically, one of the largest coal deposits in North America is underneath this land. And so there have been many attempts in the past geopolitically to remove our people and access those resources. But this law, as passed through Congress, was really the defining moment. And so there was monumental resistance. The Dene elders, many of them who did not speak English, who were, understanding what they were facing from these laws and the enforcement of them through translators, really, it said, we're not going anywhere. One of my grandmothers, Roberta Blackcoat, said that the only one that can relocate me is a creator. And so they drew a very strong line and said, we're not moving anywhere. You cannot move us. Although many were compelled to move under threat of force, there have been, at this point, over 20,000 Dene who have been forcibly removed from our homelands because of this so-called dispute. But today there are still hundreds of families resisting, many of them still very, very much elderly, with no running water, no electricity, living very traditionally off the land. And one of their greatest forms of resistance is maintaining who they are on a cultural basis, maintaining the ceremonies in connection with land, maintaining their herds of sheep, as our people are pastoral, and so forth. And so to me, this growing up in that environment really has shaped my whole life. I barely remember this, but one of my earliest memories was holding up the protest sign outside of the relocation office here in Kinflene, or occupied Flagstaff, at a protest. And the sign, my mom made it, it said, BIA, don't kill me, I'm only 3. And that there was a picture taken of that and ended up in a newspaper. And that's something that my mom and my family always remind me, they hold up. And when I was younger, I was like, whatever, I didn't really think about it. But as I became older, I really appreciated that, because that exposure to that resistance and understanding really shaped who I was. So I feel like I don't know if it's a watershed necessarily, but it was really growing up in the movement with that momentum of the powerful force and flow of resistance really is what has carried me forward. Um, you know, I think that a lot of my excitement around direct action, like the concepts of direct action and so forth, were really stimulated around the forest defense of the 1980s in so-called Northern California and like the Pacific Northwest area with like Cascadia, watching the tree sits and going up in those areas and visiting, being exposed and hosting people as they would travel and do tours throughout the country. I mean, this is a time before like, instant social sharing, with, even before indie media, right? People would travel around and do presentations, and info shops really played a key role as hubs in these networks. And, reading small zines that folks would share regarding forest defense and direct action. A lot of that was just really key. But anytime that the government forces, whether it's the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA, or Hopi or Navajo tribal police forces would come in to disrupt the ceremonies that my relatives would be holding, would attack our families and threaten them with forced relocation. And this was almost a yearly event. Those were the times that really struck me, because what I was seeing happen to our people, what we were experiencing in our family, was something that couldn't just stand by. And we'd have elders who would fight back against the police. So, with that spirit, to me, it was really defining. But yeah, I have some watershed moments. One of them, and maybe this is more of a story about the failures and challenges, was getting arrested on so-called Columbus Day in 2001, I think. Like, it was a month after the World Trade Center towers were taken down, and there was like all these terrorist threats, or nobody knew what was going on. There's a lot of intensity, and this is the time, the anti-globalization movement is really surging. Is a few years after the Battle of Seattle and so forth. And so I got arrested with like 30 people doing an occupation of mirror polishing labs at the University of Arizona, who these mirrors that were being polished were part of an observatory telescope situated on Mount Graham, which is a sacred site for San Carlos Apache, Yaqui, and other indigenous folks in that area. And they've had years-long battles, the range of actions to shut that down. It's a project that also had collaboration with the Vatican for this telescope. And so we waged this protest, this occupation, and then, it was just really one of those situations where your gut's telling you this isn't good, back out. Even in the morning, like early in the morning, a lot of folks felt the same way, but we just went along with the flow because there was a strong momentum. And then we were all tackled. We were all arrested. Everybody was arrested pretty much. That was part of the action. And it was clear there was helicopters. There was like, dozens and dozens of, vehicles. It's like every cue that you have that things are going to go sideways really quickly, we just didn't pay attention to. We're just moving forward, and there was a lot of energy and momentum. We had a good crew. And that process, many folks, including myself, faced multiple felonies, and it dragged out in court for over 2 years. Ultimately, we were able to negotiate with a pro bono lawyer who represented us a plea deal. And so things sort of really, I don't think anybody had any serious legal consequences from that. But it was such a disempowering situation. And the lessons from that were just about how to be smart in planning actions, how to be responsible, thinking about putting people at risk, thinking about the range of factors that go into that. And it took me a long time to analyze those actions, because I wasn't, an organizer. I was just, participant. It took me a long time to understand the ways that things in that moment could have gone more effective. I don't regret it, but I feel like that was a big moment of just being like, fuck, I got to figure things out and be more effective. And this wasn't the way.
Yeah, well, you kind of answered one of our other questions, which is, what do you look back at in your past and say, "Wow, I really could have done that better." um, and that's sort of like the humbling experience of having been doing this for quite some time. I'm kind of curious because one of the other questions that we have is, what does radicalism mean to you, and particularly in your geographical location? And I feel that you, perhaps more than other folks that we've spoken to, because there is that very deep ancestral connection to that land, and because it's, colonialism obviously never died, it just put on a suit and tie. What does radicalism mean to you, not just in general, but specifically in your geographical place?
Maybe this is tied to the question of like facepalm shudder, like moments. I really didn't understand the distinction between, radicalism for the longest time and like liberalism or so forth. I mean, obviously it's like clear with the left and right because they're very, solid lines that are drawn around that. But it took me a long time because I just grew up around folks that were radical and I didn't understand it in those terms. Folks who basically weren't there for, piecemeal reforms. They weren't there for, just these negotiations that would still maintain the underlying power relationships that were not there to benefit our peoples and our lands. And also just looking really clearly at the root causes, like digging deep beyond the superficial sort of, political understandings. But in many ways, to me, my understanding of radicalism has a very strong spiritual reference point because of those cultural teachings that I have. My father's a medicine practitioner, Hatathli, and I grew up with a lot of medicine people in my family. And through those consultations, through those understandings, they've always asserted that no law can be above nature. And so for me, that was an interesting point that put me more in proximity politically to anarchism. And so it was really easy to just sort of like, talk with anarchists. It was a lot harder to talk with people who were there as like these sort of white fucking saviors, feeling like they're trying to exercise their allyship and shed their guilt by parachuting in to support those in resistance in my community. And so, for me, that was an important part of that understanding of radicalism, but also how I understand radicalism is, going to the root cause, not accepting reform, basically just abolition of those structures and ideas that are oppositional to our ways of being. But again, from a spiritual standpoint as well, understanding that this is and always colonization is and always has been war. And we have to understand it on those terms. So to me, I think part of it too is also radicalism is important to understand in terms of who is mediating, whose terms actually are these issues on, and are those most impacted representing themselves really? Where are their voices? How are they centered? How are they decentered? And making sure that we disrupt, intervene in whatever level we can to ensure that that space is there for them or for us on that level. So, and yeah, I think I also just wanted to mention something about like the sort of challenges and facepalm moments, like because I think organizing is fucking messy. Like anybody who tells you it isn't probably has some cozy nonprofit paycheck, and they're just going to keep saying that because they have a nice office and they're not going to be out in the street unless they have that paycheck. I don't know, but that's full of judgment. Sorry, I am highly antagonistic towards the nonprofit industrial complex.
I
But
agree.
organizing is full of drama. It's fucking full of burnout. But it's also beautiful, dynamic, and very vibrant and exciting. And for me, I think that, uh, my sort of face palm or challenges or sort of like shuddering moments were like the breakthrough. I think addressing that was like in the experiences were all through Teleho and InfoShop, which I helped to establish in 2007, and learning that it's okay not to hold on to certain things, not to hold on to certain projects. Um, and this is like still is one of the hardest lessons for me to learn and accept, because sometimes these ideas and all the work that goes into them, no matter how many years are behind them, they need to be scrapped or composted, and that's okay. Basically, for me, is realizing that organizing is nonlinear, or that it's cyclical. Because I think so many folks, and myself included, were really focused on campaign strategies and institutionalizing ideas, and it came to the point where I realized, like, oh, it's okay to let go of these things, that sometimes shit needs to be composted. It needs to be returned to the earth so it can actually nurture something else or make space for other things to grow, especially like us older activists. Like, so
Yeah.
sorry, I'm using the term activist. I really have an antagonism with that term, but us folks who have those experiences long term, and sometimes long term in our circles in these movements is like 10 years. But the handful of us who've been doing this for over 20 plus years or more, 30 years, it's hard to accept that lesson. But, I think understanding that things are cyclical,
Mhm.
it's really important.
Yeah. Yes. I learned that lesson so much that sometimes you just got to get out of the way and let things die or let other people take up space. I remember when I think the first time I met you, Klee, was when we invited you to come to the Social Spaces Summit. I think it was in 2012 at the Thistle Institute, and you talked about this notion of the anti-retreat as a way to, well, the way that I saw it was as a way to like center relationships, center each other over the project. And I'm wondering if you are still, is that something you still think about, or maybe you can talk about it a bit first and then see how that's shifted, or if you're still using it.
Yeah, well, so at the time, Teleho and InfoShop was really vibrant, and now we don't have a functioning collective, which is actually a good thing because the space opened itself up to mutual aid in a very powerful way. Like the fact that we didn't have a collective to interface, and this other group just sort of like converged on the space and transformed it, and now has its own collective that's not operating as an info shop. It's actually a really good thing. And so back in 2012 and before that, from 2007 or so, we had a range of strong collectives at different times. We had different people coming and going. Sometimes it was a lot of Indigenous youth, but then they would cycle out because they grow up, and so forth. But yes, we had some organizing models that we learned over the years that were deeply rooted in transformative and restorative justice. Um, it's important to understand that Diné or Navajo people have a traditional peacemaking process that is culturally based and actually even today integrated into our legal system on the Navajo Nation on an official level. And so there's an option for transformative and restorative pathways to address issues in the courts on the Navajo Nation. But so we implemented those in engaged them on different levels. But our process, yes, was one that I actually still recommend to a range of other organizations because I feel it was effective, of having these what we called anti-retreats, that we would have a couple of stages of process, and sometimes they would be just a weekend, sometimes twice a year, or if there were significant incidents or issues that we had to address as a collective in our project, sometimes it would drag out for months. And so what we would do is we would look at the overall project and our personal relationship to the project and the community's relationship to the project. And we would sort of reference how sort of like temperature checks or how we were all doing and what like the effects, implications of the decisions and actions that we had were making. And we would use that as a base to strategize like what we were doing to determine if we were effective, if we were reaching whatever goals. Because info shops, really, they're sort of like outdated models to some degree with the internet. Like in the past, it used to be that like you could only find radical information at radical spaces or people who were traveling around or bands and so forth. That would be, you know, they would have zines at their table, at least, you know, especially in rural areas like where I'm at. So having info shops as hubs for those kinds of networks were really key at the time. Obviously that's changed. And so for us, we really started focusing on this concept of conflict infrastructure, how our space wasn't a safe space, but a threatening space to all forms of oppression. And so with that, we sort of developed an antagonistic position of security culture and asserting safe space or safety, safer spaces for folks, but really waging that sort of threat. And the way we would do that is about responsibility and accountability and making sure that sort of like accountability processes is also wouldn't be manipulated. But sometimes how accountability would look like, you know, confronting, intervening, and kicking people's asses if needed, you know, basically asserting boundaries and expanding those boundaries or scaling them as necessary. And so, I just had some organizational like consultation with another group, and I recommended the sort of anti-retreat model. And just like took some of those good lessons, some of the bad lessons, some of the places where perpetrators attempted to sidestep things, because that's one of the biggest challenges that we face with transformative restorative justice systems is that if we don't have cohesive and strong enough communities already, then sometimes these perpetrators can just like step outside of that and navigate around or through and manipulate it. And so those are some of the challenges that we continue to face. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's an ongoing challenge that we face and one that is key and critical and one that we take very seriously as well.
So you mentioned that, you know, the space has changed and now it's really a hub for mutual aid. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how your work specifically has changed during or because of the pandemic.
Oh my,
Tiny question.
Yeah, well, it's changed profoundly, but it's scaled. And it's interesting looking back now, like 7 months into like hardcore mutual aid work, starting back for us in March, every day. It's really interesting to think about how dynamic we've had to be, how creative we'd had to be, but also how certain projects that we already had were just amplified and we just need to direct resources towards those. When the pandemic initially hit, I was really, I guess in a way, shy to do outreach for any kind of financial support because I know everybody was struggling, and like everybody in our community and folks that we work with already are really tight. So I think that one of the shifts that we had was actually something that we didn't plan for, is just how generous people were and how much support we were able to get, especially because on the Navajo Nation, or Denebikea, as many folks were aware, then we had a serious outbreak at the beginning of the pandemic where it put our community in a trajectory where we had higher infection rates than major states. You know, I think at one point we had the highest infection rate in the whole of the so-called US based on population in our area. And so it was an extreme crisis. It was also a crisis upon many crises that had already existed because we have been fighting resource extraction, resource colonialism for years, and identifying that that is a factor in compromising our health and well-being. I mean, we have 523 abandoned uranium mines just on the Navajo Nation alone, with thousands more surrounding it. So, and there's never been a comprehensive human health study of the impacts of those abandoned uranium mines, even though the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has closed 22 wells because of high levels of radioactive contamination in those wells. We have communities that still live right next to abandoned uranium mines that have not been cleaned up. And so high levels of cancer, other autoimmune diseases, and the diabetes and range of other issues. You know, a lot of folks were in the midst of the pandemic when there was a severe outbreak on the Navajo Nation. We're looking at our community and looking at, of course, like the bad statistics, which like we live in a food desert. There's only 13 grocery stores that serve a region the size of West Virginia with a population of close to 300,000 people, which is very real. But before colonization, there was no such thing as a food desert. You know, I mean, there's a systematic tax on our food, traditional food systems that have fed into this, and dependency then upon colonial rations, and then, of course, other cheaply accessible diets, namely fast and junk foods, that have contributed to these issues. And so we've been organizing long-term on these issues. I think what the pandemic has helped to stimulate is a more clear, focused analysis on indicting resource colonialism as a key factor in making our people more susceptible to these issues, and addressing the overall, not just environmental racism, but white supremacy that exists and underpins all of this that we're facing here in this area. And so, you know, one of the most challenging things too that I think is important to address is that, you know, there were no plans here locally and regionally for unsheltered people. And since we started Teleho and Info Shop, we've been doing outreach and supporting on different levels people in the unsheltered community, particularly Indigenous folks. And there's a high population of Native folks here on the street. And so the local services are really lacking. They are highly discriminatory. We have, of course, city ordinances that severely criminalize unsheltered folks. We have anti-camping ordinances. In 2006, the National Coalition for Homelessness declared the city of Flagstaff one of the top 10 meanest cities in the whole country. You know, so that's how bad it's been. And so, you know, I called up some of the people on city council and messaged other folks, or I messaged them, I didn't call them up, and asked, what's the plan? What are y'all doing? What are we looking at in terms of what services are available for unsheltered folks? And they said, there's no plan. And so we mobilized, we organized, and we heightened everything that we were doing. We created emergency hand washing stations because they did, you know, pretty much full shutdowns of the city and services, and unsheltered folks lost all the spaces to maintain their hygiene. And just life became harder. And so we just had to amplify what we were already doing. I think the shift has been that we've had also a lot more folks step up and commit themselves in other ways that I've never seen before. Like usually people are really reactionary, but I've seen a lot more generosity in this pandemic, and it's been long-term. It's not just people coming and going. Folks are just like digging in and saying, we're going to be here and do the best we can for our community and those most vulnerable. But yeah, it's definitely like helped us clarify where we need to emphasize our work. And especially, I think it's really important to recognize that this pandemic has been happening not just upon the crisis of existing resource colonialism and ongoing attacks against Indigenous lands and bodies, but also as the attacks on Black lives have been occurring and enhanced, and the powerful uprisings that have been happening. That's also helped us shape mutual aid as mutual defense, and our response ensuring that we're looking out for each other and really going beyond this sort of slogan of strong communities, or embracing the slogan that strong communities make police obsolete, and looking at ways that mutual aid and mutual defense combined, along with the range of other resources and cultural tools that we have, like transformative and restorative justice, can help actually assert that and move that forward. And we're doing that now. It's really powerful.
I wanted to let our listeners know that we're on video talking to each other. So while Eleanor and I aren't piping in, we're like smiling big and thumbs up. And this is really inspiring. There's just so many threads to pull on. When I interviewed you for the Pandemic Solidarity book during COVID, you ended saying that an anti-colonial, anti-capitalist world already exists, and you're kind of getting at that a little bit with what you're talking about. And I really love the idea of that connection between mutual aid and mutual defense. And maybe this is a time you could talk a little bit about that connection with Indigenous mutual aid and your work you're doing there.
Yeah, it's been really exciting to see the ways that folks have responded to the idea of mutual aid. It's what an interesting time that we live in. That I think it was like the beginning of the year or last year when anti-fascism was having its moment, right? Like there were like corporate like media coverage and like, what is Antifa? And like, of course it was vilified right away. And, you know, we see the natural progression of how that has worked regarding fascism trying to reframe themselves as, you know, the true victims, you know. But what has been fascinating is that a lot of Indigenous folks who have been organizing long-term, or people who are new to organizing, have embraced the idea of mutual aid and brought it back really full circle. And sort of, you know, some folks have perhaps read Kropotkin's Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution, which I read when I was much younger and have revisited over the years here and there, and revisited again during this pandemic. And it was just fascinating to like think about, like, if there was a contemporary Kropotkin, they would just be some like weird geeky white kid, like, you know, who's just like staring at bugs for hours being like, how are they helping each other? And this is brilliant because it can counter all these arguments about natural selection and the forces of evolution and, you know, domination that were being asserted by social Darwinism and all that shit. And so we're not having any of those conversations. It's great with Indigenous mutual aid because we're like, yes, this is who we are. It makes sense. We take care of each other. At our ceremonies, we have giveaways. You know, if we get a lot of support in the work that we do in recognition, and this isn't just pan-Indigenism, then we always, you know, return back, we give back and we reciprocate. It's a natural concept. It's great that it has been embraced on a political level and it has been formalized into organizing. And to me, that's part of the reason that we started indigenousmutualaid.org, was to create a directory of the range of groups that were more grassroots and anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, because there's definitely a lot of groups that use the term mutual aid and they're just cashing in, I think, on this trend. You know, basically, I think the test is anybody who is getting foundation funding and like at the same time saying mutual aid, yet we recognize that they're just building organizational power. That's not solidarity, that is charity. And you're just trying to like solidify yourself or your organizing an organization as a relief entity. And that's just really nonprofit co-optation. You know, we've seen those trends before in a range of other movements. But yeah, folks are, you know, the young Indigenous organizers that I see, especially within the network of Indigenous mutual aid, are savvy to that. They're challenging that. They are finding creative means to radically redistribute resources and finding ways not just to put a Band-Aid on these issues, but look at long-term infrastructure that needs to be established, so supported and sustained. And they're garnering the support for that. And that is key. That is really powerful. And so, you know, that, I guess, it gets into that sort of realm of dual power. But to me, that's why I sort of asserted that an anti-colonial, anti-capitalist world already exists, because it has existed up in Black Mesa in this ongoing resistance where folks, the moment that there was food scarcity in a lot of these so-called border towns to the reservation, a lot of folks who have their sheep, who have their cows, who have their cornfields, their heirloom seeds we've passed on for generations, and who know all the wild plants that grow and what's edible and what's our medicine. They're like, okay, if Sam's Club burns down, what the fuck? We don't need them. The solution here isn't to have corporate food chains on every corner, so we're not a food desert anymore in our communities. The solution is to restore Indigenous autonomy and our ability to feed and sustain ourselves and our people. And that's been something that I think is really powerful because folks understand that and they're embracing it and they're organizing from that position towards that. And so it's more connecting to part of a cycle that has been broken or disrupted, more so in other places than others, but it is a restoration. And to me, that is what is really powerful. And it's not existing behind something, it's existing right here in our hearts. We carry that forward with us from with the teachings of our ancestors.
Yeah, it's definitely like the who gives a shit if the Sam's Club burns down. It reminds me of some of the things that I saw in Puerto Rico. This idea of like, well, after the hurricane, it's like, well, how do we stop this from happening again? How do we stop from having to rely on a system that clearly just wants us to die? It's like, oh, well, we're going to make sure that people can have their own access to their own water wells, and we are going to set up energy supplies that aren't connected to the grid and stuff like that, so that it's the idea of not spending your time petitioning the government or anything like that, but it's like, fuck it, we're going to do it ourselves because we know how and we have the skills and the abilities. And something else that you mentioned really is something that we've kind of, speaking of threads that we've talked a lot about, is this like what the youth are doing and this sort of hope for the future. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, like whether you have hope for the future based on the situations right now and how youth plays into that.
I have a lot of different ways I could respond to this question, because hope is such an interesting idea, and there's so much power with it, yet there's so much fallacy, I think, as well. And I really, I really liked, it took me a long time to understand why punk rockers would always say no future. And in some ways, to me, I think there is like a strong sense of like misanthropic nihilism that propelled that idea. An understanding of the concept of no future is not your future, not their future, not the oppressor's future, not a future of exploitation and domination, perpetuating systems of control. And so the idea of hope for me, and this is something that I challenged folks in the past, like John Trudell on, because at one point he provocatively said he doesn't believe in hope because it distances people from their own agency. In some ways, that's my paraphrasing, not his words. And I said, well, that's such a strange assertion, because what do you tell young Indigenous folks who statistically face real serious propensity towards suicide? What do you tell them is the opposite of hope? Because they're living in it. If that exists, if despair exists, then we have to have something. And that's where I go back to, I think, Joan Baez's quote that action is the antidote for despair. And for me, I really look at not this sort of like hollow concept, thinking forward that things will change and I'll just suffer through whatever the existence is now. I look at stimulating empowerment, agitating and provoking action to intervene and transform the conditions that we face right now. And to me, that's really like closing. If we can close this sort of like distance between the kind of future that we want, the kind of healing that we need. If we can close that distance and bring it closer, that's the kind of hope that I embrace. So not something far off in a way. And is something that we should and helps to, you know, keep people moving forward, but it shouldn't be blind. You know, I like critical hope. I like fierce hope. I like hope that burns cop cars.
Yeah.
You know, you can smell hope in the burning, you know, the smoldering smoke of a burning cop car.
I love it.
Yeah.
How about y'all? What, you know, curious as like perspectives in that question. I'm sure you're asking a lot of folks that.
Yeah, we were talking about how we're going to interview each other one day for an episode.
Okay, I won't get
just to put ourselves on the front lines of this conversation. No, it really resonated with the Zapatistas also really talk about there is no future. We only have the present. We only have today, and if we want to do something about the conditions, we have to act today. And then, you know, or I think Howard Zinn has a quote about we just have a succession of presents, right? And I think that's important, but it's interesting when you bring it back to youth, though, because youth are completely socialized to think about the future. So I just started a project called Grounded Futures that's about supporting youth and doing storytelling through platforms to try to mess that up a little bit. So that's where I'm at on that conversation of futures and hope. And I'm with you. I think you got to smell it. You got to smell the burning cars. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I usually tell people that I have hope but no optimism, and I do the demarcation between those two, because optimism is like, no, everything's gonna be fine. I'm just gonna sit back here and fuck it. And but hope is like, and then of course there's like the difference between, like you mentioned, Klee, like the idea of the sort of hope, the false hope that politicians give you and they run their slogans on and shit like that. And there's the actual hope that comes from like seeing people on the front lines, like side by side, really doing the work. And like I'll oftentimes tell people that, you know, with this work, you oftentimes see like the worst that humanity is capable of, but you also see the best. And that's what gives me hope, is that I've seen what people are capable of when shit is awful. And so I know that we have the capacity and the ability to do better and build better. And we're doing it, you know, in the midst of this absolute capitalist, colonialist chaos shit show. And that gives me hope, like pretty much every day.
That should be a hashtag. Absolute capitalist colonial shit show. I don't know. That probably wasn't exactly what you said, but close enough.
Close enough. We can do bumper stickers.
Yeah, and I think to me, it gets back, especially when we're talking about youth and future, like the socialization that you were talking about, is this idea that we exist in a linear time frame, and that to me is part of the colonial construct that we need to break. Really understanding how life exists in cycles helps us to understand that there are other ways of being in existence, and not just this sort of like linear beginning, middle, and end, especially in a Christian, you know, colonial social construct. That means the logical conclusion of that is apocalypse. And so there's actually a piece that we published at indigenousaction.org called Rethinking the Apocalypse, an Indigenous Anti-Futurist Manifesto. And that the beginning of that piece, it asks the question, why can we imagine the ending of the world, yet not the ending of colonialism? And so I highly recommend reading that piece, because I think a lot of thought went into that. It's a sort of complex, but not complex piece.
I often say that, you know, we can imagine the end of the world quicker than we can imagine the end of capitalism too, right? It's just, and kind of swinging back to this moment in time, like there's a lot of conversation about that this is the end times, and I'm like, yes, can it be the end of colonialism and the end of capitalism? Like, can we talk about it in this way? And a lot of people get really freaked out about that conversation because they think it's, that I'm meaning it in a doomer way or a collapse way. And I'm curious how you wrestle with that idea of, yeah, just end times.
Well, yeah, and maybe should just share a little bit from the Rethinking the Apocalypse piece, because that really gets into this. And so part of what is written there is it's an apocalyptic that colonizes our imaginations and destroys our past and future simultaneously. It's a struggle to dominate human meaning and all existence. This is the futurism of the colonizer, the capitalist. It is at once every future ever stolen by the plunderer, the warmonger, and the rapist. This has always been about existence and non-existence. It is apocalypse actualized, and with the only certainty being a deathly end. Colonialism is a plague. Our ancestors understood that this way of being could not be reasoned or negotiated with, that it could not be mitigated or redeemed. They only stood that the apocalyptic only exists in absolutes. Our ancestors dreamt against the end of the world. Many worlds have gone before this one. Our traditional histories are tightly woven with the fabric of the birthing and ending of worlds. Through these cataclysms, we have gained many lessons that have shaped who we are and who we are to be with one another. Our ways of being are informed through finding harmony through and from the destruction of worlds, the elliptic, birth, death, rebirth. We have an unknowing of histories upon histories of the world that is part of us. It is the language of the cosmos. It speaks in prophecies, long carved in the scars where our ancestors dreamed. It is the ghost dance, the seven fires, the birth of the white buffalo, the seventh generation. It is the five sons. It is written in stone near Oribe and beyond. These prophecies are not just predictive. They have also been diagnostic and instructive. We are the dreamers dreamt by our ancestors. We have traversed all time between the breaths of our dreams. We exist at once with our ancestors and unbirthed generations. Our future is held in our hands. It is our mutuality and interdependence. It is our relative. It is in the creases of our memories, folded gently by our ancestors. It is our collective dream time. It is now, then, tomorrow, yesterday. It goes on, but yeah, it's, I think like
Wow.
the
Stunning.
future is our relative, I think is something that is a concept that's really important, and our prophecies are part of that.
I love that's beautiful. One of the nations here that I live on, the Squamish Nation, they have a word, Kwiatsomo, and it means future and past generations. It's like I just loved that idea of it being one. It's just one thing, the past and the future. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That was, I'm like marinating in all of that. Wow. Carla, do you want while I marinate?
Sure. In the spirit of holding up new people on the scene and celebrating each other, is there a new organizer or activist or collective that inspires you right now that you'd like to amplify?
Etsy from so-called Los Angeles is one of the most fierce, powerful queer Afro-Indigenous organizers. They write and run a range of amazing projects, and they're a powerful artist. I don't know if they're new, but I think everybody should introduce themselves to them. The Autumn Anti-Border Collective, which is a new formation. It's led by fierce Autumn femmes that have been holding it down in really strong resistance to the border wall devastation and desecration in their lands. Recently, they had over 10 people arrested. They were tear gassed in a confrontation on the so-called border area of their lands. So they're very powerful. Folks should just support them in every way they can. And really all the grassroots radical indigenous mutual aid organizations right now, specifically, I think Little Wind and Messiah, with the Regeneration on the Reservation project, which is another queer Afro-Indigenous led mutual aid project that deserves everybody's support and attention right now.
You're listening to Silver Threads, part of the Grounded Futures multimedia platform. For more information and to donate to our totally ad-free show, check out groundedfutures.com. You can reach out to us with thoughts and suggestions at silverthreadshow@protonmail.com. You can find out more about our host Eleanor via artkillingapathy.com and our host Carla via joyfulthreadsproductions.com. And now, back to the show.
It's interesting. A lot of the people we're talking with are artists as well. And often musicians, filmmakers. Eleanor is also a musician and a filmmaker and an artist, and I'm a filmmaker. I'm not a musician. I'm not allowed to sing. But yeah, do you want to talk about that, how that enlivened your life, or where that came from, and maybe a little bit about your music, or?
Oh, it's a complicated relationship. I'm a recovering musician. Really, I feel like music, it sometimes is the catharsis, yet other times it is really part of the disease, the ailment. I don't want to call it a disease. There was at one point, and maybe this is a watershed moment I should have shared earlier. There's this one point when in, I think 2011, we had waged years, decades of struggles to protect the Holy San Francisco Peaks located here in northern Arizona, which is a mountain that's holy to 13 indigenous nations. And when I say holy, it's essential for our cosmology, our spirituality. It's a place where deities live. It's a place where we make offerings we can't make other places. We gather herbs that aren't found other places and so forth, a place of emergence. And so for years, this ski resort has been trying to expand their desecration. And most controversially, back in 2001, they proposed to make snow out of treated sewage, using 180 millions of treated sewage that they would purchase from the city of Flagstaff and pipe 14.8 miles up the mountain to make snow for recreation. And so we fought this. First of all, it's a disgusting proposal, right? But they had political support. They had social support from the white recreationists here, of course. And we fought it through every means, petitions, protests, rallies, court, litigation, a range of different strategies. And of course, all those failed. And I say, of course, because there's no justice on stolen land. And so we were not surprised when it failed. And so it came down to bulldozers that were starting up to clear the way for this as part of this desecration for this project. And so there was a time where, I was on tour like 80% of the year, and a guitar wasn't going to stop a bulldozer. So I had to stop everything I was doing and just, take up those direct action skills and intervene. So music propels me. I wrote a whole album, actually. I released it at the sort of beginning of this year, I guess, the end of the year, beginning of the year, called The Unsustainable Sessions. And everything in that album addresses what we were talking about, the apocalyptic, despair, hope, and the fight, the struggle, if you will. And it's interesting because some of those songs are really intimate. Like I can't listen to them right now because I feel like for me, that's a healing process. And so there's a lot of pain. We have to confront the pain in order to heal. We have to challenge that, especially for Dene. Traditional practitioners, we actually have a diagnosis of what the root cause of the pain is before we actually heal. And this gets back to my radicalism, right? It's because it's compared to Western medicine or allopathic medicine, where they just look at the symptoms and treat those most typically. Our traditional medicine practitioners have an actual ceremony that is done before you actually have the healing work done to figure out what is wrong, the root cause. of beyond the symptoms. And so that process and making art and creating, for Dene folks are really culturally, there was no dichotomy between art and our ways of being. And sometimes it's hard for me to make that distinction because I think capitalism wants to objectify. The tendency is to anything that you produce, it needs to be objectified and quantified based upon whatever metrics, like how many sales you have, how many likes you have, shares you have, etc. Most of the music I make these days is for myself. It's for healing, and it's also like a call and maybe like a sort of collective licking of the wounds for other folks who might be going through the same shit, because we're not alone and we shouldn't be. And music, I think more than anything, has always been one of those forces that has ensured that we're not alone, and even though we can be tormented as those media creators, the storytellers, there's something powerful with that. And so it's a complicated question when you bring up music for me, because sometimes I don't want to talk about it. And other times, I just want to make sure it's a political conversation and we're talking about either propaganda or healing with it.
I can absolutely relate to that. I actually posted just a couple of days ago that that I have a very push-pull, like soul-tugging relationship with music, and I probably always will. And I was actually talking to a friend of mine who's struggling with this too, and he said, like, I can't like figure out how to make money off of this. And I was like, well, that's the problem. You really shouldn't be making money off of your soul. That's kind of creepy. Like the whole concept of it is eerie, and of course, it's become something that's like so incredibly consumer driven, like the rock star or the film star or the whatever. And but at its core, like James Baldwin said, like artists are the ones who tell us what it is to be alive on this planet and get through it. And how like that is the antithesis of capitalism. So like trying to capitalize on that is really absurd. But I also wanted to as a musician or an artist or whatever, like you're of course inspired and influenced by other artists. And I was sort of wondering if there was a particular either politically overt, like radical music or art form that inspired you, or yeah.
Oh, so many of them. Tanarwin is one of the ones that comes to mind at first, and they've become popular most recently. But they're a Tamashek or Tuareg group from the sub-Sahara desert in Mali, and their songs are, about survival, about beauty, and about resistance, because they took up arms. Had AK-47s on one side and guitars on the other, and they were propelling the movement with their songs and, part of that narrative in their militant uprisings in that area. There's so much powerful music being made during this time. Really, like Alas is a powerful artist that they do hip hop and just wonderful, just biting, fierce music. I think right now there's a really powerful moment with queer Indigenous artists, like folks in the Rise Collective. There's a really great band in the Pacific Northwest, so-called Pacific Northwest, called With War. And there's like a lot of queer Indigenous artists that are making beautiful noise and providing a powerful soundtrack to tearing shit down. But yeah, I mean, the soundtrack to my life right now isn't necessarily music. It is like the amazing conversations that we have that are muffled behind masks while we're packing supplies for those most vulnerable. It's the like muffled chanting in chorus, calling, for justice with Black Lives Matters and Native Justice Now against white supremacy and police violence in the streets. Like that soundtrack is the most powerful soundtrack I've ever heard. I take breaks from movement or music sometime just because I just feel haunted by it. Like once I really get into it, I want to start playing with it. And that to me is like a weird sort of, maybe not a curse necessarily, affliction.
Yep. I can feel my guitar staring at me throughout this conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, connected to that, we also ask everyone, and maybe this is just as big a question, but is there a book or even an action that you would recommend or that like really sparked your early thinking? I mean, you already mentioned Kropotkin, but maybe something else.
Yeah. Well, so my aunt, Marie Gladue, she's from Big Mountain. Her mom was the powerful matriarch, Catherine Smith, who iconically, her image was used. She, if you see it, is a Diné grandmother holding an old rifle. But her image was used as this iconic image for the militant resistance up in Big Mountain. And she gave me the book by Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, when I was in high school. And that fucked up my world. Like it was really a challenging read. It was a high level of reading. And I, every year I would reread it and just come back to certain understandings. Today, when I reread it, I really feel sort of dissociated from the not necessarily the approach, but some of the analysis, the politics to some
Yes.
degree, but the idea of liberation and idea of that the that really those who are going to liberate the oppressed are the oppressed. No one else I can resonate very strongly with, and that was very powerful for me. Um, I was really influenced by a lot of zines, like zine culture, like political zine culture, especially like late 80s, early 90s. It's fucking amazing. One zine, particularly 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance by Zigzag, I think is incredible. It's very dense. It's basically a book. It was turned later into a comic book, I think published by PM Press. But the original zine, highly recommend it. Conquest, Sexual Violence and American Indian Genocide by Andrea Smith is amazing, profound. The intersections of feminism and the struggle to protect Mother Earth is very powerful. The Revolution Will Not Be Funded by Insight, another really powerful book that implicates the ways that the nonprofit industrial complex is highly exploitative and designed to undermine movements ultimately. Another zine is Locating in Indigenous Anarchism by Aragorn. And that was published back in 2005. I actually originally read it in this weird publication, anarcho-primitivist publication called Green Anarchy. But that zine, that's another one that it's a very short essay or zine. And I just would reread it over the years. And it helped me to articulate myself as an anarchist more so than I think anything that I've written or read by anarchists. And another book, I think the only other recommendation I'll make right now is How Nonviolence Protects the State by Peter Gilderlew. And of course, like classics like Wretched of the Earth. But even that book, I have some challenges with. There's another essay I highly recommend called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, which is really profound and powerful and just reaffirming in terms of this sort of decolonial fetishism that we see these days, that everything is sort of branded as decolonization. There's even a book out there called Decolonizing Wealth, which is really absurd. Yeah, it's just like this sort of like weird co-opted approach to decolonize capitalism, I guess.
Yeah.
It's absurd. But yeah, so interestingly enough, I can hardly name any musicians or bands right now, but I can list for days books and essays and
Yeah.
commentary out there. A lot of just brilliant writing and really awesome provocative stuff.
Yeah, I hear you on the zines. It's one of the things about the, social spaces or info shops closing. partly, as you mentioned, they're not needed as much, but also because of mass gentrification in cities, not being able to afford the rent. But that's one of the best things is the zine culture. The Purple Thistle, we had one of the most amazing zine uh, collections, and a lot of those resonate. Zigzag, also known as Gordhill, collaborated and worked out of the Thistle a lot. So, yeah, that book is amazing.
And there's actually two more books. Sorry, I
Yeah.
forgot. One is Bitterwater Chronicles of Deneb Resistance or Oral Histories. It's called Bitterwater. It's written by Malcolm Benally, one of my relatives, and it's narratives. He interviewed a lot of the Indigenous matriarchs in the resistance at Big Mountain, and that, like, for anybody who's interested in like what I was referring to, like my radicalism and political inspiration, that book really encapsulates that, the spirit especially. And I think honestly, and I just probably just need to state this, that everybody should read. There's a zine called What is Security Culture? A Guide to Staying Safe. You can check out Sprout Distro online for that, or just Google search it. But everybody should be reading about security culture these days.
Yeah, we're actually planning more security trainings, but we're over an hour. But I kind of wanted to get this question in because I think you'll have a rad answer to it, and that is, how do you feel that your journey's still evolving?
So as Dene, we have a philosophy called Sanoi Bikehojon, which translates to over in old age or ahead of us, we seek health and harmony, a balance with existence. And so this is a guiding understanding in our way of being. We're always growing, we're always learning, we're always challenging ourselves, being critical. I look forward to trying to be as effective as possible. And we need to celebrate those small victories that we have, even the smallest ones, the smallest moments, but also embrace those failures and challenges and learn from them so we can continue to grow. And if we don't do that, we're just lost and arrogant. And I really feel like on whatever level, wherever people are at, and this is something that I'm telling myself constantly as well, that we need to have that idea of reflection. So for Dene folks, we have a cycle of understanding that is actually represented within our 4 primary sacred mountains. We have 6 holy mountains that represent our cosmology and uphold our universe. But we have 4 main mountains, and one starting in the east with our thought, and Saskis, our thinking. Then in the south with our planning, and then in the west with Ina, or our life, and actually making those plans come to fruition. And then in the north we have Sihasin, which is reflection. And then it goes back into a cycle. So that's the way I look at my evolution, is guided by these mountains, guided by our covenant with creation and the sacred responsibilities that we have to protect all life and beings, to maintain that balance and harmony with not just the human relations, non-human beings as well. And so my evolution is, I always seek to grow my understandings of my cultural teachings. Looking forward, I see that those challenges, those rough spots, like if we're walking barefoot, and if you only do that once and you're not used to it, you're really sensitive to it. But the more you do it, you get those calluses. That's sort of the way I feel my evolution. It's not a hardening of the spirit. It's a comfortability with the earth. Because this is how we live with our environment. We have to feel that, and it informs us how the earth is also doing and what we must be doing in return, the ways that we must be walking in this path towards that healthy future in existence. There are going to be lots of fucking pebbles in the path, some fucking boulders too. Sometimes we got to walk on fire. Mm-hmm. And we need that filling our hearts, that spiritual wherewithal, the joy, the fortitude, everything to help us carry forward. I don't know if it's evolution, and like there's an opportunity for cliched statements of revolution, but I'm antagonistic towards that term because I'm more interested in not like, transitioning one power force for another one, and like the process of doing that, which is revolution. I'm more interested in liberation, abolishing all these fucked up ways of being, all these fucked up colonial institutions and systems of domination, capitalism, cis heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, all these violent forms of oppression. I'm more interested in celebrating and dancing and walking on the ashes of their ruins.
Silver Threads is recorded in different places across borders. Carla is located in Canada on Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh lands. Eleanor is located here and there, usually either in Sweden or on Piscataway land, now known as Washington, D.C. And our guests join us from around the world. You can find out more about the show and our guests at groundedfutures.com. To learn more about Eleanor's work, visit artkillingapathy.com and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at activisteleanor. For Carla, follow her on Twitter and Instagram at joyfulcarla. You can also reach out to us at silverthreadsshow@protonmail.com. And lastly, if you want to support the making of the show, you can donate over at groundedfutures.com. Thank you to the Grounded Futures team for supporting us with promotion. All of the snazzy graphics that you see are created by Jamie Lee Gonzalez. Grounded Futures is a multimedia platform and is produced by Carla Bergman, Jamie Lee Gonzalez, and Melissa Roach. Post-production audio for our show is done by Eleanor Goldfield. The intro and outro music for our show is a song called Floodlight by Eleanor's former band, Rooftop Revolutionaries. Thanks for listening, and now let's go rattle thrones and topple empires.